2, Trenton, New Jersey. A few minutes before midnight, Jack Twist opened the door and left the warehouse, stepping into the wind and sleet, and some guy was just getting out of a gray Ford van at the foot of the nearest loading ramp. The van's arrival had been masked by the rumble of passing freight train. The night was deeper on the warehouse, except for 4 meager patches of murky yellow light from poorly maintained, grime-dim security lamps. Unfortunately, one of those lights was directly over the door through which Jack had exited, and its sickly glow reached precisely far enough to include the passenger's door of the van, out of which the unexpected visitor had appeared. The guy had a face made for police smug books, heavy jaw, a mouth that was hardly more than a slash, a nose that had been broken a couple of times, and hard little pig eyes. He was one of those obedient but pitiless sadists that the mob employed as enforcers, a man who, in other times, might have been a rape and pillage specialist in the armies of Genghis Khan, a grinning Nazi thug, a torture master in one of Stalin's death camps, or a Morlock from the future, as imagined by H.G. Wells in The Time Machine. To Jack, the guy looked like serious trouble. They startled each other, and Jack did not immediately raise his .38 and put a bullet in the bastard, which is what he should have done. "Who the hell are you?" the Morlock asked. Then he saw the canvas bag that Jack was dragging with his left hand, and the lowered pistol in Jack's right hand. His eyebrows shot up, and he shouted, "Max!" Max was probably the driver of the van, but Jack did not wait around for formal introductions. He did a quick reverse into the warehouse, slammed the door shut, and stepped to the side of it in case someone out there started using it for target practice. The only light inside the warehouse came from the brightly lit office far at the back of the building, and from an overhead bank of widely spaced, low-wattage bulbs set in tin shades, which were allowed to burn all night. But there was sufficient illumination for Jack to see the faces of his 2 companions, Mort Gersh and Tommy Sung, who had been following him. They did not look as happy as they had been only a couple of minutes ago. They had been happy because they had successfully hit a major way station on the route of the Mafia cash train, a collection point for narcotics money from half the state of New Jersey. Suitcases and flight bags and cardboard boxes and styrofoam coolers full of cash arrived at the warehouse from a score of couriers, most of it on Sunday and Monday. Tuesdays, mob accountants in Pierre Cardin suits arrived to calculate the week's profits from the pharmaceutical division. Every Wednesday, suitcases full of tightly banded sacks of greenbacks went out to Miami, Vegas, Los Angeles, New York, and other centers of high finance where investment advisors with Harvard or Columbia MBAs on retainer to the Mafia, or Fratellanza, as the underworld referred to itself, wisely put it to work. Jack, Mort, and Tommy had simply stepped in between the accountants and the investment advisors and had taken 4 heavy bags full of cash for themselves. "Just think of us as one more layer of middlemen," Jack had told the 3 glowering thugs who were, even now, tied up in the warehouse office, and Mort and Tommy had laughed. Mort was not laughing now. He was 50 years old, pot-bellied, slump-shouldered, balding. He wore a dark suit, pork pie hat, and gray overcoat. He always wore a dark suit and pork pie hat, though not always the overcoat. Jack had never seen him in anything else. Tonight, Jack and Tommy were wearing jeans and quilted vinyl jackets, but there was Mort looking like one of the guys in the background of an old Edward G. Robinson movie. The snap brim of his hat had lost its sharp edge and gone slightly soft, rather like Mort himself, and the suit was rumpled. His voice was wary and dour. He said, "Who's out there?" as Jack slammed the door and stepped hastily away from it. "At least 2 guys in a Ford van," Jack said. "Mob?" "I only saw one of them," Jack said, "but he looked like one of Dr. Frankenstein's experiments that didn't work out." "At least all the doors are locked." "They'll have keys." The 3 of them moved quickly away from the exit, back into the deep shadows in an aisle between piles of wooden crates and cardboard cartons that were stacked on pallets. The merchandise formed 20-foot-high walls. The warehouse was immense, with a wide array of goods stored under its vaulted ceiling. Hundreds of TV sets, microwave ovens, blenders, and toasters by the thousands. Tractor parts, plumbing supplies, Cuisinarts, and more. It was a clean, well-run establishment, but as with any giant industrial building at night, the place was eerie when all the workers were gone. Strange, whispery echoes floated along the maze of aisles. Outside, the sleet fell harder than before, rustling and ticking and tapping and hissing on the slate roof, as if a multitude of unknown creatures moved through the rafters and inside the walls. "I told you it was a mistake to hit the mob," Tommy Sung said. He was a Chinese-American, about 30, which made him 7 years younger than Jack. Jewelry stores, armored cars, even banks, okay, but not the mob, for gosh sakes. Stupid to hit the mob. Might as well walk into a bar full of Marines and spit on the flag. "You're here," Jack said. "Yeah, well," Tommy said, "I don't always show good judgment." In a voice of doom and despair, Mort said, "A van shows up at this hour, it means one thing. They're delivering one kind of shit or another, probably coke or horse, which means there won't be just the driver and the ape you saw. There'll be 2 other guys in the back of the van with the merchandise, carrying converted Uzis or worse." Tommy said, "Why aren't they already shooting their way in?" "As far as they know," Jack said, "there's 10 of us, and we have bazookas. They'll move cautiously." "A truck used on dope runs is sure to have radio communications," Mort said. "They'll have already called for backup." Tommy said, "You telling me the Mafia has a fleet of radio vans like the goddamn phone company or something?" "These days they're as organized as any business," Mort said. They listened for sounds of purposeful human movement in farther reaches of the building, but all they heard was sleet hitting the roof. The .38 in Jack's hand suddenly felt like a toy. Mort was carrying a Smith & Wesson M39 9mm pistol, and Tommy had a Smith & Wesson Model 19 Combat Magnum that he had tucked inside his insulated jacket after the men in the office had been securely tied up, when it had seemed that the dangerous part of the job had been completed. They were well armed, but they were not ready to face down Uzis. Jack remembered old documentaries of hopelessly outclassed Hungarians trying to turn back invading Russian tanks with rocks and sticks. In times of trouble, Jack Twist had a tendency to melodramatize his plight and, regardless of the situation, to cast himself in the role of the noble underdog battling the forces of evil. He was aware of this tendency, and he thought it was one of his most endearing qualities. At the moment, however, their position was so tenuous that there was no way to melodramatize it. Mort's thoughts had led him to precisely the same consideration, for he said, "There's no use trying to get out by any of the back doors. They'll have split up by now, 2 in front, 2 in back." The front and rear exits, both the regular doors and roll-up cargo bay doors, were the only ways out. There were no openings, not even windows or vents, on the sides of the enormous building, no basement and therefore no basement exit, no way to get onto the roof. In preparation for the robbery, the 3 of them had studied detailed plans of the building, and now they knew they were trapped. "Tommy," said, "what are we going to do?" The question was addressed to Jack Twist, not to Mort, because Jack organized any robbery he took part in. If unanticipated events required improvisation, Jack was expected to come up with the brilliant ideas. "Hey," Tommy said, taking a stab at brilliance himself, "why don't we go out the same way we got in?" They had entered the building with a variation on the Trojan horse ploy, which was the only way to bypass the elaborate security systems that were in operation at night. The warehouse was a front for the illegal drug trade, but it was also a real, functioning, profitable warehouse that accepted regular shipments from legitimate businesses in need of temporary storage for excess inventory. Therefore, with the personal computer and modem in his apartment, Jack had tapped into the computers of both the warehouse and one of its reputable clients, and had created the file of electronic paperwork that would legitimize the delivery of a huge crate, which had arrived this morning and had been stored per instructions. He, Mort, and Tommy had been inside the crate, which had been designed and constructed with 5 concealed exits so they could get out of it quickly, even if it was blocked by other crates on 4 sides. A few minutes after 11 o'clock tonight, they had slipped out and had surprised the tough guys in the office, who had been quite confident that their multiple alarm systems and locked doors had transformed the warehouse into an inviolable fortress. We could get back in the crate, Tommy said, and when they finally come in and don't find us, they'll go crazy trying to figure out how we got away. By tomorrow night, the heat'll be off, then we can slip out and make our getaway. No good, Mort said sourly. They'll figure it out. They'll search this place until they find us. No good, Tommy, Jack agreed. Now here's what I want you to do. He quickly improvised an escape plan, and they assented to it. Tommy hurried to the master panel of light switches in the office to kill every light in the warehouse. Jack and Mort dragged the 4 heavy bags of money toward the south end of the long building, and the dry sound of canvas scraping along the concrete floor echoed and re-echoed through the chilly air. At that far end of the building, instead of more stacks of merchandise, there were several trucks that had been parked in the interior staging area where, first thing in the morning, they would be loaded. Jack and Mort were less than halfway through the maze, still half a city block from the semis, when the dim lights winked out and the warehouse was plunged into unrelieved darkness. They paused long enough for Jack to switch on his ever-ready before continuing through the gloom. Bearing his own flashlight, Tommy rejoined them and took one of the bags from Jack, one from Mort. The clicking impact and susurrant slide of sleet upon the roof began to subside slightly as the storm entered a lull, and Jack thought he heard the screech of brakes outside. Could reinforcements have arrived so soon? The warehouse's interior loading zone contained 4 18-wheelers, a Peterbilt, a white, and 2 Mack trucks. Each of them faced out toward a loading bay door. Jack went to the nearest Mack, dropped his sack of money, stepped up on the running board, opened the door, and shone his flashlight inside along the dashboard. The keys dangled from the ignition. He had expected as much. Confident of their multi-layered security system, the warehouse employees did not believe there was any danger that one of these vehicles might be stolen during the night. Jack and Mort went to the other 3 trucks, found keys in all of them, and started the engines. In the cab of the first Mack, there was a sleeping berth behind the seat where one member of a long-distance driving team could catch a nap while his partner took the wheel. Tommy Sung stowed the 4 bags of money in that recess. Jack returned to the Mack just as Tommy finished with the sacks. He settled in behind the wheel and switched off his flashlight. Mort got in on the passenger side. Jack started the engine but did not switch on the headlights. All 4 trucks were idling noisily now. Carrying his flashlight, Tommy ran to the farthest of the 4 big roll-down doors of the interior loading zone and touched the control that started it moving laboriously upward on its track. Jack watched him tensely from the high seat of the big rig. Tommy hurried back along that outer wall, his progress marked by the bobbling beam of his flash, slapping his right hand against the door controls as he came to each of them. Then, snapping off his flashlight, he bolted toward the Mack as the 4 doors slowly lumbered open with much grating and clattering. Outside, the Morlocks would know the doors were going up, would hear the truck's engines, but they'd be looking into a dark building, and until they could throw some light in here, they couldn't know which rig was the intended escape vehicle. They might spray all of the trucks with submachine gun fire, but Jack was counting on gaining a few precious seconds before they opted for that violent course of action. Tommy clambered up into the cab of the Mack, pulling the door shut behind him, sandwiching Mort between himself and Jack. "Damn rollers move too slow," Mort said as the bay doors clattered toward the ceiling, gradually revealing the sleet-lashed night beyond. "Drive through the sucker," Tommy urged. Fastening his seatbelt, Jack said, "Can't risk getting hung up." The door was 1/3 open. Gripping the wheel with both hands again, Jack saw movement in the murky, wintry world beyond, where the few dim exterior security lights did little to push back the darkness. Two men hurried across the wet and icy blacktop from the left, slipping and skidding, both of them armed, one of them with what appeared to be an Uzi. They were trying to stay low to make poor targets of themselves and trying to stay on their feet at the same time, squinting into the black warehouse under the rising bay doors, and as yet they had not thought of meeting the crisis with an indiscriminate spray of bullets. The first door, the one in front of Jack, was halfway up. Abruptly, angling in from the left, the same direction from which the two hoods had come, the gray Ford van appeared, its tires churning up silvery plumes of slush. It fishtailed to a stop between the second and third ramps, blocking those exits. Its front wheels were up on the lower edge of the third ramp, so its headlights speared into the fourth bay, revealing that the cab of that truck was untenanted. In front of Jack, the door was 2/3 up. "Keep your heads down," he said. Mort and Tommy squeezed down as low as they could, and Jack hunched over the wheel. The heavy rolling panel was not all the way up, but he thought he could slip under it with a little luck. In quick succession, he released the brakes, popped the clutch, and hit the accelerator. The instant he put the truck in gear, those outside knew that the break was being made from the first bay, and the night was shaken with the rattle of gunfire. Jack heard slugs slam into the truck as he reached the exit, drove through, and headed down the concrete ramp, but none penetrated the cab or shattered the windshield. Below, another van, this one a Dodge, swept in at the foot of the incline, trying to block his path. Reinforcements had indeed arrived. Instead of braking, Jack tramped down harder on the accelerator and grinned at the horrified expressions of the men in the Dodge as the massive grille of the Max slammed into them. The rig rammed the van backwards so hard that the smaller vehicle tipped over on its side and slid 15 or 20 feet across the macadam, M-A-C-A-D-A-M. The impact jolted Jack, but his safety belt held him in check. Mort and Tommy were thrown forward against the lower part of the dash and into the cramped space below. They protested with cries of pain. To execute that maneuver, Jack had been forced to descend the ramp faster than he should have done, and now, as he tried to wheel the truck to the left toward the lane leading away from the warehouse, the rig lurched, swayed, threatened to either tear itself out of his control or tip over as the Dodge had done. Cursing, he held on to it, brought it around with an effort that made his arms feel as if they were pulling out of his shoulders, and then he was headed straight into the lane. Ahead of him, 3 men stood around a midnight blue Buick, and at least 2 of them were armed. They opened fire as he bore down on them. One man aimed too low, and bullets snapped off the top of the Max grill, sparking brightly where they struck. The other guy aimed too high. Jack heard slugs ricocheting off the brow of the cab above the windshield. One of the 2 overhead-mounted air horns was hit and torn loose. It fell down along the side of the cab, thumped against Tommy's window, hanging from its wires. Jack was almost on top of the Buick, and the gunmen realized he meant to hit it, so they stopped shooting and scattered. Handling the huge rig as if it were a tank, he broadsided the car, shoving it out of the way. He kept going past the end of the warehouse, toward another warehouse, past that one, still accelerating. Mort and Tommy pushed themselves back onto the seat, groaning. Both were battered. Mort had a bloody nose, and Tommy was bleeding from a small cut over his right eye, but neither of them was seriously hurt. "Why does every job go sour?" Mort asked morosely, his voice more nasal than usual because of his injured nose. "It hasn't gone sour," Jack said, switching on the windshield wipers to clear away the glimmering beads of sleet. "It's just turned out to be a little more exciting than we expected." "I hate excitement," Mort said, putting a handkerchief to his nose. Jack glanced in the side mirror back toward the Fratellanz's warehouse, and he saw the Ford van turning around to follow him. He had put the Dodge and the Buick out of commission, and he only had the Ford to worry about. He had no hope of outrunning it. The roads were treacherously icy, and he had too little experience behind the wheel of a rig like this to risk pushing it to its limits in bad weather. He was also worried about an unnerving chorus of small noises that had sprung up from the engine compartment following the ramming of the van and the Buick. Something rattled tinnily. Something else hissed. If the Mac broke down and left them stranded, they would very likely be killed in the ensuing shootout with the Morlocks. They were in a vast industrial area of warehouses, packing plants, and factories, and the nearest major city street was more than a mile ahead of them. Though some of the factories had night shifts and were currently operating, the industrial park's main service road along which they were speeding was deserted. Glancing at the mirror, Jack saw the Ford on their tail and gaining fast. He abruptly wheeled the rig to the right into a branch road past a factory where a sign proclaimed Harkright Custom Foam Packaging. "Where the hell are you going?" Tommy asked. "We can't outrun them," Jack said. "We can't face them down either," Mort said through his bloody handkerchief. "Not handguns against Uzis." "Trust me," Jack said. Harkright Custom Foam Packaging did not operate a late shift. The building itself was dark, but the road around it and the big truck lot behind were lit by sodium vapor lamps that colored the night yellow. At the rear of the building, Jack turned left into the truck lot through drilling sleet that looked like molten gold under the big lamps. 2 score of trailers without cabs attached stood in orderly ranks like beheaded prehistoric beasts, all painted mustard by the fall of sodium light. He swung the rig in a wide circle, brought it in close to the back wall of the factory, doused the headlights, and drove parallel to the building, heading back toward the road that entered the lot and along which he had just come. He braked to a stop at the corner, close up against the factory wall at a right angle to the branch road. "Brace yourselves," he said. Mort and Tommy already knew what was coming. Their feet were pressed flat up against the dashboard and their backs were jammed against the back of the seat as protection against the impact. No sooner had Jack braked at the corner of the building, the Mac poised like a crouching cat anticipating a mouse. Then a glow appeared on the passing road. The light approached from the right, from the front of the factory, the most outreaching headlamp beams of the unseen but oncoming Ford van. The glow grew brighter, brighter still, and Jack tensed, trying to wait until the last best moment before pulling into the lane. Now the glow became 2 distinct parallel beams, lancing past the snout of the Mac, and the beams grew very bright. Finally, Jack tramped hard on the accelerator, and the Mac lurched forward, but it was a big truck, not quick off the dime. The Ford, going faster than Jack had expected, shot past the corner directly across the Mac's bow. And Jack surged forward in time to catch only the rear of it, but that was enough to send the small van into a spin. It whipped around 360 degrees, then again on the icy surface of the parking lot, before crashing nose first into one of the mustard-colored cargo trailers. Jack was sure that none of the men in the Ford was in any condition to come out of the wreck shooting, but he did not dawdle. He swung the Mac around and headed back past the side of Harkright Custom Foam Packaging. When he reached the main service road, he turned right, away from the distant Fratellanza warehouse, toward the entrance to the industrial park and the network of city streets beyond. They were not followed. He drove 3 miles by a direct route to an abandoned Texaco service station that they had scouted days ago. He pulled past the useless pumps and parked alongside the dilapidated little building. The moment Jack halted the rig, Tommy Sunk threw open the door on his side, jumped out, and walked away into the darkness. He was heading for a lower middle-class residential neighborhood 3 blocks away, where, on Monday, they had parked a dirty, rusted, battered Volkswagen Rabbit. The car was newer under the hood than it was outside, and fast. It would get them back to Manhattan, where they would dump it. They had also stashed an untraceable Pontiac in the industrial park on Monday, within a 2-minute walk of the mob warehouse. They intended to hump the bags of money to the Pontiac, then drive the Pontiac here for the switch to the Rabbit. But alternate transportation had become essential, and the Pontiac had been left to rot where they stashed it. Jack and Mort heaved the sacks of money out of the Mac and stood them against the sidewall of the shuttered service station, where the slanting sleet began to crust on the canvas. Mort climbed back in the cab and wiped down all the surfaces they might have touched. Jack stood by the bags, looking at the street beyond the end of the rig, where an occasional car crept past on the glistening pavement. None of the motorists would be interested in a truck parked at a long-abandoned service station, but if a police car cruised by in patrol... At last, Tommy pulled in from the side street and parked between the rows of pumps. Mort grabbed 2 sacks, hustled them toward the car, slipped, fell, got right up, made for the rabbit again. Dragging the other pair of bags, Jack followed with greater care. By the time Jack reached the rabbit, Mort was already in the back seat. Jack threw the last bags in with Mort, slammed the door, and got in front with Tommy. He said, "For gosh sakes, drive slow and careful." "You can count on it," Tommy said. The tires spun on the sleet-skinned blacktop as they pulled out from between the pumps, and when they left the lot and moved onto the street, they slid sideways before the tread gripped. "Why does every job turn sour?" Mort asked mournfully. "It hasn't turned sour," Jack said. The rabbit hit a pothole and began to slide toward a parked car, but Tommy turned the wheel into the slide and got control. They continued at an even slower pace, found the expressway, and climbed a ramp under a sign that said New York City. At the upper end of the ramp, as the tires slithered one last time before gripping and carrying them onto the expressway, Mort said, "Why'd it have to sleet?" "They've got a lot of salt and cinders on these lanes," Tommy said. "It's going to be all right now, all the way into the city." "We'll see," Mort said glumly. "What a bad night, Jesus." "Bad?" Jack said. "Bad? Mort, they would never in 1,000 years let you in the Optimist Club. For gosh sakes, we're all of us millionaires. You're sitting on a fortune back there." Under his pork pie hat, which still dripped melting sleet, Mort blinked in surprise. "Well, I guess that does take some of the sting out of it." Tommy Sung laughed. Jack laughed, and Mort too, and Jack said, "The biggest score any of us ever made, and no taxes payable on it either." Suddenly everything seemed uproariously funny. They settled in 100 yards behind a highway maintenance truck with flashing yellow beacons, cruising at a safe and leisurely speed, while they gleefully recalled the highlights of their escape from the warehouse. Later, when the tension was somewhat relieved, when their giddy laughter had subsided to pleased smiles, Tommy said, "Jack, I gotta tell you, that was a first-rate piece of work. The way you used the computer to create paperwork for the crate, and that little electronic gizmo you used to open the safe so we didn't need to blow it. Well, you are one hell of an organizer." "Better than that," Mort said. "In a crisis, you're just about the best knockover artist I've ever seen. You think fast. I tell you, Jack, if you ever decide to put your talents to work in the straight world for a good cause, there's no telling what you could do." "Good cause?" Jack said. "Isn't getting rich a good cause?" "You know what I mean," Mort said. "I'm no hero," Jack said. "I don't want any part of the straight world. They're all hypocrites out there. They talk about honesty, truth, justice, social conscience, but most of them are just looking out for number one. They won't admit it, and that's why I can't stand them. I admit it. I'm looking out for number one, and to hell with them." He heard the tone of his own voice changing from amusement to sullen resentment, but he could not help that. He scowled through the wet windshield past the thumping wipers. "Good cause, huh? If you spend your life fighting for good causes, the so-called good people will sure as hell break your heart in the end. Fuck 'em." "Didn't mean to touch a nerve," Mort said, clearly surprised. Jack said nothing. He was lost in bitter memories. 2 or 3 miles later, he said quietly, "I'm no damn hero." In days to come, when he recalled those words, he would have occasion to wonder how he could have been so wrong about himself. It was 1:12 a.m., Wednesday, December 4th.